Good morning and greetings. In this session, we look at some of the psychological overtones in the events, statements, or teachings by Jesus. Most people overlook the psychological depth, the psychological nuances in the teachings of Jesus Christ, in the spiritual vision of Jesus Christ, for the simple reason that Christians are trained to relate to biblical texts in isolation from the lived realities of this world. Whereas the actual implication in the incarnational view of life, incarnation being the Word becoming flesh and dwelling in the midst of people, is precisely the opposite. So the Word is in theory recognized as incarnational, but is in interpretation used as though it is purely and thoroughly disincarnational. And this inversion of the true nature of the Word, Jesus as a living Word, has shut a vast majority of believers out from the finer and perhaps the more relevant, useful implications in the teachings of Jesus. And the purpose in this session is to recognize it through a particular instance. I use only one instance in the interest of focus and clarity. That instance is found in the Gospel of St. Mark chapter 5 from verse 25 to 34. Mark chapter 5 verse 25 to 34. And this is the very familiar account of Jesus healing a woman who had been suffering from an issue of blood, as the particular ailment or affliction is referred to in this text. She had been suffering long and she had been to many doctors, and as this text says with some degree of humor, very subtle humor, let me read those particular verses. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years and who had suffered much under many physicians. There's a kind of ironic reflection on medical sciences, perhaps. She suffered not only from her affliction, but it so happened that the prolonged treatment of her affliction at the hands of many physicians also turned out to be yet another affliction. Well, that's not our main line of inquiry, but this is just in passing. So she was in this predicament for a very long period of time. And obviously, what is absolutely obvious is that those who try to help her, in fact, there's no indication here that those she approached for help did not want to help her, though the outcome of their service, the service they rendered to her, was more of a troubling kind or disabling kind or depleting kind than otherwise. Now, here is a predicament of an individual, a woman who has been suffering for a long period of time. Then there is the predicament of a social scientific mechanism, the medical world, the world of physicians, which obviously was very different from what we are familiar with today. But the basic relationship is the same. How a patient relates to a doctor, how a doctor relates to a parent or patient, or the doctor-patient or healer-patient interaction. That's substantially the same, except that with the advent of technology or the incursion of technology into the sacred space of healing has substantially altered the quality of healer patient relationship. And this is something that has been discussed for a while in the medical circles, though I noticed that in the last 20 years, this discussion has been shifted to the side burner. That's again incidental. So she related to the medical system or system of medical help available at her time. And there's also a hidden aspect. She had been relating to others as a social relationship. The common denominator in all of this is that she has ended up depleted. That's the most important thing to realize. Whoever she related to, whether it is domestically, whether it is socially, whether it is professionally in terms of the healer-patient relationship, she ended up being continually depleted. That's the most important thing to realize about this woman. The more she related to people, the more hollowed out, emptied she became. Therefore, the focus in this particular episode, and this episode is unique. If you look at all other episodes in the four Gospels, you find that there is none other comparable to this. And therefore, this episode demands particular attention from us, and it is quite unique, and it lends itself to amazing investigations. And I hope that as we continue with this reflection, you will be persuaded of it. Now, so this has been her predicament. There's a serious relational problem. This relational problem has three dimensions. One, there is a relational problem in her relationship with herself. After all, this is an internal problem. The issue of blood is the organic physical manifestation of what is essentially an internal problem. It's a non-organic problem manifesting itself as an organic problem or biomedical problem, if you want the technical term used in the medical context itself. It is a non-biomedical problem manifesting itself or being understood as a biomedical problem, which actually relates to how this individual is placed in relation to herself. She is not able to relate to herself properly, how she relates to her, say, domestic context, a social context, and finally the professional context, the medical context. This is a relational problem. And that's the universality of this event. And the sad part of this is that there is hardly any resource available within her context to deal with the relational problem. Now, in order to understand this clearly at this point, I need to introduce a particular view or particular framework or perspective on this issue, on the issue of relationship. Now, I remember reading a book by Tolstoy. The title of the book is On Life. Now, Tolstoy says, if anyone were to ask me the meaning of the whole of the Bible, the meaning of spirituality, world spirituality in general, I would use only one word, that's relationship. All of life comprises relationship, and unfortunately, human beings are relationship challenged. Tolstoy doesn't use this expression, I'm using it myself. We are incapable of building and sustaining wholesome and life-empowering, life-enhancing relationships. And this is a very serious problem. Unfortunately, it's not being paid adequate attention to. And if you look at the life of Jesus Christ, his work, and how he related to people in general, you realize that this is at the heart of the gospel. Perhaps more needs to be said about it, but the present context doesn't allow me to go into details in this. For the time being, it suffices to say that the question of relationship is central to the spiritual concerns about human welfare. The wholeness of being a human being. We cannot but relate because we are social animals. Not only because we are social animals, we are also spiritual animals. And at this point, you can't separate the social from the spiritual. When it comes to the relational aspect of a human being and the welfare or the wholeness that is at stake here, spirituality and social dimension become integral, become one. So, the universal incapacity of the human species is the incapacity to build healthy relationships. And the tragic aspect of this incapacity is that building healthy relationships is basic to being human. So we are mortally wounded in relation to our capacity to be relational. That's the issue highlighted here, though in Christian proclamations on this text, this is never even mentioned, never even recognized. Now, what about relationships? If you look at the biblical text, starting from the book of Genesis right to the end, the last book being the book of Revelation, you find that the perspective on relationship in the Bible is reciprocal. God has established relationships on the foundation of reciprocity or mutuality. For example, love your neighbor as yourself, do to others as you would that they should do to you, so on and so forth. If you don't love your neighbor as yourself, you cannot love God. And if you love God, you cannot but love your neighbor as yourself. And if two neighbors love each other as they love themselves, then it ensures perfect reciprocity, and that creates the stable foundation for life-enhancing relationship. Or take another example. When Paul talks about the ideal relationship between a man and a woman, he says, husbands and wives must submit to each other as though they are submitting themselves to Jesus Christ. I think this is in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21. Submit to one another as though you're submitting yourself to Christ. Now, what is the purpose in saying this? The purpose is to ensure that the relationship that the man and the woman in question would build is one of reciprocity. All right? I submit myself to my wife, she submits herself to me, and both within the framework of submitting oneself to Jesus Christ. This is the perfect framework for enduring reciprocity, which is a necessary foundation for making relationship life-friendly, life-enriching, and spiritually valid. Unfortunately, this is the one aspect in which millions and millions of people are challenged. They're incapable of reaching this level of relational refinement. Instead, what's happening? Mutuality or reciprocity is renounced or abandoned. Renounced is a positive word, so I withdraw that word. Is abandoned. And relationships are established on the foundation of unilateralism. And unilateralism results in conscious, unconscious, take it as you like it, results in manipulation, domination as well as subjugation. So human relationships are vitiated by the psychology of domination as well as subservience. In fact, most relationships in the world are of this kind. One party dominates and the other party plays the subservient role, but the party who plays the subservient role plays its own game in order to compensate this resentment bred by domination. Nobody wants to be dominated, but unfortunately in a relationship you have to accept, one of the two parties has to accept the shall I say, the contingency of being dominated or being subservient, which is accepted in grudgingly, and the person who does so lives in secret resentment, which then plays out in a variety of ways. So relationship becomes a kind of cat and mouse game, subtle, controlled in most cases, but of course in many cases it continues to erupt in a volcanic fashion from time to time. So this is actually at the root of the cultural idea of the gender wars, the gender war. All right, now what happens is, I can talk about it very clearly because I had the opportunity to serve as the principal of a college in India, where I had to relate to my colleagues. And the most tiring thing for me was that for 9 years I lived like this woman. I was a man suffering from an issue of blood for 9 years. What do I mean by this? Fortunately, my college was a small college. It was a small college by design. It was founded after the Cambridge model, which emphasizes the importance of teacher-student relationship, and in order to facilitate it, the size of the college was meant to be very small. So I didn't have to relate to a large faculty. I had only about 85 teachers working with me. But I tell you that each day, by the time evening came, I was so completely depleted in energy. I would just go and collapse into my bed. The reason being that, as you know, one of the important things the principal of a college has to do is to relate to all teachers. Of course, non-teachers as well, but primarily teachers and students. It was a joy to relate to my students, but it was extremely trying and taxing to relate to the teachers because of this problem. I was astonished to find how incapable my colleagues were to build healthy, just, fair, mutually enriching relationships. Every one of them wanted to function unilaterally. They wanted to suck the blood out of whoever they could relate to, not just to me. And in fact, there was an acute case of a lady colleague who just couldn't sleep a night unless she had caused some turbulence, some trouble to someone, because that was the way she was attaining some degree of self-validation. But the interesting thing was, and this is what I want to underline, that she was extremely popular, though many people had been ruined by reposing their trust in her. She was extremely popular, and people related to her with a degree of intensity that I found quite astonishing. Then I went into the psychology of it, and I realized that many people are very keen to be subjugated. They're keen to be dominated. They're keen to be led by the nose. And there will be an individual or a small nucleus of individuals who are very happy to have people of that kind to follow them, so that they can build this relationship of unilateralism, of a small group or an individual and a small cabal around that individual dominating the entire group, and the entire group following the leader, as it were, like a sheep following shepherd. So the outcome was that interacting with this kind of individual persons with character orientation proved to be an extremely energy-zapping experience for me. So it was very much like being bled from, say, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., being bled every day. Not blood in terms of our blood in the vein, but being blood in terms of the energy that an individual has. So I can understand this problem very, very clearly and acutely. And now in this context, if you were to remember the man-woman relationship envisaged in the book of Revelation, in the book of Genesis. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Now notice that in this particular version, It's the man who is required to make greater sacrifices and make greater investments into building the man-woman relationship. It's a man who has to leave his father and mother. The woman is not required to do so. It's very interesting. Why? Because culturally, the domineering role had been assigned to the male. The female is an adjunct to this organization or institution of marriage. So in order to compensate that, in the biblical version, it's the man who has to make the sacrifice. He has to leave his father and mother and cling to his wife. Only then can they become one flesh. The idea of being one flesh, man and woman becoming one flesh, is that it excludes 100% perfectly. It excludes the possibility of mutual manipulation or one party domineering the other. Both are equally taken care of. That's the beauty of this idea of relationship. Of course, it's the ideal, and most people write it off saying that this is not realizable in the world. But again, that's a personal choice. I personally don't endorse skepticism or disenchantment or prejudging possibilities. Rather, I would endeavor to the end to see if reciprocity can be established. But in saying so, I'm realistic enough to also to concede that it's not an easy thing to do. There are hard psychological cases in which no matter how hard and for how long you try, it's simply impossible to establish reciprocity. Then all you can do is what Socrates did: stay focused on your mission. But in the case of Socrates, it is said that Socrates deliberately chose Xanthippe, a woman of bad temper, a termagant as it were, because if the report is correct, we don't know, but Socrates himself never said a word about it. This is what those who were associated with him reported. He so chose Xanthippe, knowing that she is a woman of bad tongue, ill temper, and domineering spirit, in order to perfect his patience. Anyway, so it's a different approach to life. Now here, the case of this woman, obviously, she was one who was perhaps conditioned by her circumstances and perhaps also by her character orientation, which is not separable from how she has been conditioned, especially by parenting, to play a submissive role. There are some people like that. Instinctively, they cast themselves in the submissive mold. They invite domination by others. And if you put such characters in relation to people who are otherwise who are normal, the relationship that they'd still build up with such individuals would be one of self-abnegation, self-surrender, and inviting the domineering relationship from the other person. So in other words, such individuals derive some kind of secret psychological pleasure in being dominated. At the same time, they suffer on account of it. And this is the complexity of the problem. And what makes it even more complicated is the fact that they themselves are unaware of it. And therefore, if you ask them, and if they begin to trust you, they'll tell you that they have a raw deal from life, that they are the wrong end of the stick as far as life is concerned. So this woman perhaps represents this important psychological chunk of reality of life. And therefore, it's not surprising that the many physicians she had recourse to could not help her, because they simply could not understand what the woman was suffering from. They could not diagnose her. Now, why I say this is the problem with the woman is that for the first time in her life, she's coming across someone from whom energy can flow into her. All the relationships she had experienced till then, all the many individuals she had known till then, from members of the family to members of the society, members of the religious group, whatever, they were the sucking types. They sucked the energy from her. They used her. They manipulated her. And unfortunately, she herself couldn't help playing this subservient, submissive role that invites this domination and exploitation. And therefore, for many years, for as long as she could be an individual, she lived bleeding. That's the tragedy of this woman. She lived bleeding. But the point, of course, is that she herself was complicit in this, even though she wanted to get out of it. But there was no way she could, because the orientation that she really needed to get out of this, this existential bleeding was simply not available in her social context. It was not within her reach. For the first time in her life, she comes across someone who is exactly the opposite of anyone else she had ever known in life. Someone from whom energy can flow out. So far, the many individuals she had known, she had related to, were such that they sucked the energy out of her, and each encounter left her sucked dry, depleted. And that was why she was much afflicted. So, in such a context, either there is the reality of chronic, unending conflict. The individual who is being manipulated, exploited, drained out, fights back as hard and ferocious as possible. But many people cannot sustain this, so they settle down. They accept. They get resigned to their predicament. And this is true particularly in Eastern societies, where options for women are socially, culturally, and religiously limited, in fact, abolished. Instead, women are indoctrinated from birth onwards to accept the fact that whatever be their plight, via matrimony, they have to accept it. You know, in Hindi there is a saying, "Nibhana padega." That is to say, you have to endure and carry out your obligations as a woman, which is to endure. You have to carry out all your responsibilities. Others have no responsibilities. Others need to have no restraint. Others don't need to have any regard for her, for the integrity, the inviolability of her personality. She has to endure it all. And there's much literature that exalts, romanticizes, eulogizes women who do so, because it suits the convenience of a male-dominated society. So it's very interesting now, if you read the text, the heart of the key to this psychological interpretation, psycho-spiritual interpretation of this event, the event of Jesus healing the woman with an issue of blood for 12 years, is in this particular verse. Where is it? Jesus says, and Jesus, verse 30, and Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him. Power had gone out from him. Now, this was quite a new experience for her. Whoever she had touched till then sucked the energy out of her. For the first time in her life, she comes across someone whom, when she touched, power flowed out of him into her. Now, Jesus, therefore, inverses the domineering relationship model and transforms it into a spiritually proactive model in which the passion of covetousness is replaced with the desire to give. Therefore, if you study the secret of the spiritual power of Jesus, you find it's all in this positivity of giving. God's will, the Son of Man has come not to be served, but to serve and to give his life, to give his life as a ransom for the sins of the world. It is this idea which is concretized in the Eucharist, or what the Catholics call the Mass, or what in Kerala many traditions call the Qurbana, which means the sacrifice, that which is set apart for God. where Jesus takes the bread and the wine, which are the objective correlatives or the symbolic correspondence of his body and his blood, his everything, and gives. Breaking of the body is the ultimate emblem of the renunciation of the will to receive, the will to pour, as Schopenhauer and following him Nietzsche put it, the will to power. It's Schopenhauer who sort of focused the attention of Europe on this idea of the will to power. Of course, others are not oblivious to this, but he is really the foremost figure, and then following him Nietzsche. So, and therefore it makes sense that Nietzsche ridicules this whole biblical Christian vision of life in which meekness is promoted. And if you were to read The Antichrist by Nietzsche, you'll get more on this. So, what should we learn from this issue? The whole episode is an illustration of the need to build or to inculcate or to develop in ourselves the capacity to build healthy relationships. We victimize many people without knowing it. Very often people don't realize that they are of the sucking kind, that they suck the energy out of people. And therefore, without even knowing it, without intending to do so, they do a lot of harm to people around them. And Jesus represents a character or personality orientation completely contrary to this. He revels in giving. Jesus is light. He says, I am the light of the world. Light is nothing but, as science would tell us, a continuous outward flow of energy. Light doesn't take anything from you. It only gives. It is darkness that sucks up everything. So human nature is poised between these two possibilities of being light or darkness. The world, as the gospel says concerning the birth of Jesus, those who were in darkness, those who were languishing in darkness have seen a great light. The orientation of the world is the orientation to take. The foremost and the most dramatic manifestation of that is war. That's why war is inevitable and ineradicable, because it is deeply rooted in human nature. In contrast to that, you have the Prince of Peace, who came to give the whole of himself. He took nothing from anyone. That's why he has nowhere to lay his head. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. The foxes have their holes, the birds in there have their nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Why? Because having indicates taking, which is exactly the opposite of what the genius of Jesus' personality meant, which is the joy of giving. Ironically, it's the one who has nothing who can give us peace. Therefore, he says, come to me, only that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. In contrast to this rest out of a relationship, the outcome of our relationship with Jesus is rest. The outcome of relationship with many people on the face of this beautiful planet is conflict. So rest and conflict. What shall we choose? Well, it's up to you. So read this episode again from the 5th chapter of Mark's Gospel. Meditate. I've given you only a tentative framework for your continued investigation and further assimilation of the eternal truths, psychological insights that are embedded in biblical texts, to which, unfortunately, not enough attention has been paid. So this is merely illustrative of what further work can be done in understanding the contents of the 4 Gospels. I thank each one of you for your patient attention. attention, and may you be blessed for it. Thank you.